Hello everyone, I'm Isaac and I'm a sociologist. I've been teaching research methods classes for the last couple of years as a teaching assistant, and I've recently graduated from a master's program in sociology where I did a lot of ethnographic fieldwork. I also have experience conducting research projects, both quantitative and qualitative, within commercial and government settings. And I'm doing these videos because I really want to talk about social research and methodologies because I found there are a lot of ways, textbook ways of explaining or introducing research methods. They're either rigid or very vague, maybe sometimes a bit of both. And this makes it very hard for people without any experience to understand what is going on. Because when it's very rigid, you hear terms that you've never heard before, and you're like, okay, so what does that mean? And if it's very vague, you hear a term that you have heard before, but the context that you've heard it in doesn't make any sense in what's been explained right now. And so I want to try and do this video series to cover an introduction to social research methodologies in a way that can bridge these two, that can talk about, well, social research and formalized methodology with everyday curiosities that you might experience, the ways that you go about life and think about things or puzzle about things. And ultimately, I want to try and talk about research as an extension of this everyday curiosity. Um, our innate curiosities, our innate the things that we want to find out, this drives research. In my experience, in my opinion, it drives research. And the link here, the big difference between simply puzzling over something yourself and trying to make a research project out of it is that you introduce methodology. And that is the context within which I'm going to be talking about social research in these videos. As a note, I'm wearing this mask as a pop filter because I couldn't get the audio to be okay otherwise. But if it adds any mystique, then that's a little bonus. To get started, I'm gonna first talk about research. I need to talk about what this is by problematizing it first, okay? So, these descriptions that are out here, these are textbook descriptions. They are literally from this textbook called The Practice of Social Research that I've become rather familiar with over the last couple of years. Um, the thing about these points, right? They are important. They do make sense. If you think about, oh yeah, I want to find out what's real, and yeah, that seems like a useful thing to do, right? Or you think about, yeah, I want to avoid making inaccurate observations, or I want to avoid being illogical. All these sound like good things. They are good things. I don't have a fault with these statements in of themselves. It's just that they're so broad that they don't really help. Well, they didn't help me understand what research actually was. And in my experience, most people hearing these phrases, you can apply this to any part of your life. So, what exactly makes this research, right? What makes this specific to research? And so, I'm going to unpack these terms in this video. And after I unpack them, I'm going to try and reconstruct a slightly different, hopefully clearer understanding of what research might be when you go about and do it. So, first, right, this matter of inaccurate observations. I'm going to discuss them as matters of empiricism because that is kind of how the textbook describes it. So, inaccuracy, or, well, basically, accuracy is described as you verify this by having empirical data to review, and you have lots of empirical data. You do this multiple times, you have multiple readings, and or you have multiple people doing these readings so that can confirm your observations. So, in this sense, it's the textbook seems to be claiming that, oh yeah, if you have empirical data, you cannot be inaccurate. Empiricism is the solution to this. But two things. One, is this a new point to have empirical solid data proof that you can now share with other people, right? Observable and experienceable stuff. Because in your daily life, don't you already ask people for, say, screenshots to verify the latest gossip? Or maybe you ask multiple friends if this thing has really happened. You already engaged in empiricism. So the textbook response that says, okay, yeah, this is what sets researchers apart doesn't really sit well with me because we already know this. It's a very intuitive human thing to try and verify stuff with what you can observe and what you can share in experience wise. So there's that. But the next bit is empiricism also contains its own problems. For example, if the solution of empiricism, like pure raw empiricism here, is to just have multiple readings of this data, so you keep looking at it, you keep observing it, and it's the same every time. You ask all your friends, and they say the same every time. Then what happens with situations like the dress? Because every time I look at this dress, I see white gold. I've always seen it as white gold since the start, since this first came out. And right now, I can go out there, and if I want to make an empirical claim that this dress is white gold, I can go out there, find all the people I know who say it's white gold, and be like, look, all of us have seen this as white gold ever since it came out. You people who see it as black blue, fundamentally wrong. Something is wrong with your eyes, so on and so forth. So one, that doesn't help us understand the phenomenon. Two, it leads to this very strange situation where now your claims about this being good research or this being a fact are reliant entirely on, well, majorities. And that in and of itself can lead to many other problems. I will touch on one of them later. But yeah, there's that issue. Secondly, the data on its own also doesn't help you understand the phenomenon, right? So even if we have all this empirical data that, yes, some of the world sees this as white gold and some of the world sees this as black blue, it's not gonna help us know why half the world sees it this way and half the world sees it another way. You need to bring in other things. You need to bring in theory. You need to make sure that you're looking at the data in useful angles for understanding this problem. And so, I want to say instead that when it comes to making sense of data, making sense of the empirical experiential world around us, right? It is a lot better instead of thinking about this as, oh yeah, the majority has verified this, so it must be true, or experts have verified this, so it must be true. Don't worry about that too much. Instead, focus on, with this data, what exactly is this data? What is the nature of it, right? So what I mean by nature here is you can think of a common divide in a lot of research is quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative data, now your data is represented in terms of numbers, right? The nature of this data is now neatly packed into little boxes. People have said that they really like this or they don't like this on a scale of 1 to 10, so on and so forth. Neatly packed out. Or is your data a little messier, like with qualitative data? Where someone may tell you, okay, I really enjoyed this, but for these reasons. And there was this one other part which I didn't really like, and so on and so forth. And after all of that, maybe you don't get a neatly packed number, right? The nature of this data affects what you can do with this, how you can think about it, what you can use it for. And that is an important thing to pay attention to. Next, what does your data represent? Does this represent, and this sort of linked to the other point about how do you know what this represents, right? Let's say you want to study a certain phenomenon, okay? And I'll have a shocking example after this to talk about that. But let's say you want to study a certain phenomenon, and you go out and you get your data for this, and you claim that this represents it. What if there's something else going on, right? Could it be that the thing you're looking at is not actually what you're looking at? And this also includes this question of how do you know what it represents? This brings up issues of methodology, and I will delve further into that too. How your data is gathered, there's also an aspect of methodology. So when thinking about data, I think it's much more useful to think about, yeah, what does this represent and how do you collect this so that you can now say with confidence that it represents a certain case or a certain situation that you are trying to discuss or make sense of, okay? And now for the shocking example. So there's this study by the University of Virginia where they basically put a bunch of students individually. So they got individual students. They told the students, all right, we're going to put you in this room. There is a box that can give you an electric shock in there. And yeah, we're just going to leave you there. So they left students in there for 15 minutes. And this graph in this tweet shows that the majority of them shocked themselves instead of just sitting there waiting with their thoughts for 15 minutes. So, having described the methodology of the study, right? They took students, they told them that there's a machine that will cause them shocks, and they left them alone with the machine. With this methodology, the data that you get now, right? The data that is straight up there that you can see is how many people shock themselves and how many times they shock themselves. This chart shown here shows that men were more likely than women to shock themselves. Roughly 60% of men, I think. I might be seeing this wrongly, it's a little small. But yeah, a sizable chunk of men shock themselves, and roughly a smaller amount of women shock themselves, but women still shock themselves. With this data, right, what can you now say about it? So this is what I mean by why it's important to know what your data represents and how you got it to this point. Because all three of these headlines are interpret this data differently. And the data allows itself to be done that way, to be treated that way. So the tweet treats this as oh yeah, this is funny, like, haha, men are likely to do silly things or hurt themselves, boys will be boys, you know, that kind of thing. So it seems to be implying that, right? This headline by science.org seems to imply that, well, this is an indicator of internal turmoil, right? They're saying that, oh yeah, if you're left alone with thoughts, that really sucks. It's much better to feel physical pain than it is to feel mental pain. And they're making that comparison between, yeah, preferring physical to mental boredom if you go and follow the link. And then the UVA Today article frames this as an act of doing something. It doesn't even talk about the pain, right? It's just like, oh yeah, doing something is better than doing nothing for most people. So like, okay, kind of straightforward, kind of plain there, right? The thing is, all of these are fair descriptions of the data. The data does let you make these claims now. But at the same time, right, could there be stuff in here that lets you interpret this even further? Are there more ways to interpret this data? Could, for example, and this is the one first thoughts I had when I first saw this was, yeah, could there be something to do with human curiosity? Like if you are, okay, for myself at least, if I am left alone in a room with a machine and nothing else to do, I'm like, yeah, I just want to see how it works. Even if someone told me that gives you a shock, I'm just like, I want to see how that feels. I'm curious about how it feels. It's not necessarily a matter of boredom. It's not necessarily a matter of internal turmoil or masochism or whatever. It's just, yeah, I want to try it out, you know? Same reason why people might go skydiving and all that, right? Why would people do scary stuff to themselves? Because they're curious. So there's that. Could it also be matters of, let's say, mistrust in the scientist's instructions? Maybe they were told that, yeah, we'll come and get you in 15 minutes. But maybe they're like, okay, maybe it's a trick. They want to just see when we'll press this, and then after we press this, they'll let us out, so on and so forth. So could there be something in that, right? Or could there be something else entirely going on with this? For all of these scenarios, what you actually need, for all these interpretations, what you need is more data. Whether you can be sure about this, all relies on claims of, well, analysis of more data, and or framings of theory and methods of interpretation. For instance, with more data, I believe that they have information out there about how many people shock themselves more than once. That information about shocking themselves more than once, this may go beyond the mistrust. This may disprove the idea that I had about mistrust in scientists' instructions, right? Because they shock themselves once and the scientists can come get them, then be like, oh yeah, I'm just curious. I just want to play with this. I like the feeling. Um, who knows, right? And you can see how new data brings in new possibilities, new ways to think about this, new ways to analyze this. So what I want to emphasize for empiricism is that it is not an end-all in and of itself. It is just a start. Having empirical data, having information out there, it is just the start of a research project. You still need to think about what you do with this. And that brings me to discussions about matters of bias. So I'm talking about overgeneralization and selective observation, the points raised by the textbook, under this category of bias because of the way it's described. The core idea is that, yeah, people are very good at identifying patterns, right? For instance, that's how we have constellations. People looked in the sky and like, yeah, those stars kind of look like a spoon, so I'm going to call it the Big Dipper, so on and so forth. It's also how you have things like memes, right? People recognize that you put certain formats together, you can communicate information of a certain flavor more rapidly or more effectively than other things. Certain jokes don't work if they aren't accompanied by certain pictures, for example. So you have that. And also, countless theories, right? About how you might understand the world. Theory, in and of itself, is a form of pattern recognition. You've seen this pattern so many times, you can theorize that this will now continue to exist. You can make predictions based on this. And I'm going to talk a bit more about theory afterwards when I discuss logic. But yeah, so all of these little aspects, pattern recognition, we already engage pattern recognition. We are very good at it. And so what the textbook says here is that the problem with humans being so good at pattern recognition is that many humans will identify these patterns wrongly. And it says that to get around this, you revert to empiricism, you get many, many verifications. Replicate inquiry. But as already pointed out, having more people say the same thing as you doesn't necessarily help. That's just having a majority thing. But research is not necessarily about majority, right? It's about understanding what is going on there. If you want to understand, for instance, why the dress was the way it is, you need to do more than just have people say, yeah, I see it as white gold as you, same as you. So empiricism, not an end all here. And the textbook also suggests that you can unbias your identifications by bringing in theory and or methodological things. Basically making predictions based on background knowledge before you go into it. So for instance, right, let's say the textbook suggests this, you commit to a specified number of observations and specific types of observations. So let's say you want to do a little study. You're making this claim that all men have beards. Okay, I do not have a beard underneath this mask, but this is purely hypothetical. So let's say you do this claim: all men have beards. You want to verify this claim, right? if you're focusing just on the empirical aspect of things and making theoretical predictions and then testing your empirical stuff, it doesn't solve this problem because, one, even if you take the method of, okay, I am going to find exactly 100 men, and this way you don't weasel out of it, right? You don't find 50 men and then you see a 51st man walk towards you without a beard. You're like, no, I'm done with the survey. My data's concluded. No, you have to keep going until you get 100. So there's that. And two, if you specify that men will be self-identified, for example, so you can't be like, you have no beard, you're not a real man. You still have to take them in there and be like, oh yeah, my theory is disproven. Right? So the textbook claims that if you do these steps, you now eliminate bias. But the thing is, these steps regarding methodology, they raise entirely new questions, right? Why that sample size? Why 100 people, right? Why not 150? Why not 200? Why not everybody who identifies as male? Especially if your claim is that big, right? If your claim is so big about all people being a certain way, why not find everybody? So why that sample size? Secondly, why that observation type, right? Why are you asking men to identify themselves that way? Or why are you identifying men for them? So on and so forth. How are you going about this, right? Also, where are you finding these people from? Um, are you standing in the street and doing this? Or are you asking people by word of mouth and all that, right? Raises so many questions about how you're getting this data for bias. And even on the level of theory, let's say you have certain theories about what things should be or how things might be. For instance, with the UVA study on electric shocks, it seems quite clear that they're operating from a psychological standpoint where people just don't want to be left alone with their thoughts, right? So there's this assumption that people do not want to be left alone with their thoughts when he started it. But why that? And why not, as mentioned already, the angle of, let's say, curiosity, right? This is a never-ending logical chain. No matter what you pick, there will be people who now ask you, yeah, that seems biased. That seems like you're going against what I'm picking at. And if you think about this in your daily lives, you will do this a lot as well. You are very familiar with this sort of identification, especially if it is with things that you do not like or things that you disagree with. Um, for instance, you hear a government person that you dislike say something, and then you're gonna be like, yeah, of course they'll say that. They have no backbone. Politicians have no spine. He'll change his mind next week, and then when he changes his mind next week, you're like, yeah, see, I was right about that. But the only reason why you thought that in the first place is because you were questioning their perspective. You're questioning their claims. Why would they say this? Right? The thing is, I've come to the understanding that we can never ever get rid of bias. Bias will always exist. It is part of human endeavors because we are limited. We have to pick and choose. We have to do certain things. Sometimes these choices aren't explicitly conscious. Sometimes they're built off habit. But we will have to do certain things at the expense of others. Okay. This happens in all sciences. It is not a social science thing as well. For instance, if you think of, let's say, someone studying climate change, right, through natural science, there are so many approaches to climate change. Some people might study this from the ecological angle, right? What trees or plants or animals do you need to keep in the ecosystem to help deal with climate change? Others might view this from a pollution angle. What stuff do you need to stop putting in the atmosphere? What else could we put in the atmosphere? Or how can we take things out of the atmosphere? So on and so forth. And not just atmospheric pollution, right? Waterways and all that stuff. All of these specific angles, right? These are all areas which could be viewed as biased by other people. And to be fully fair, they do contain bias. It is an inclination towards something. This, in and of itself, is not wrong. There's no problem with bias. Bias causes problems when it is unaccounted for, when it is hidden. For instance, if I claim that yes, this person will always be wrong, or this group of people will always be wrong about this thing. This group of people will always be that way, right? Or if I make a broad claim about, let's say, human nature, right? Yeah, like basically what I described. But I don't make that clear first. I just have this assumption that yes, people are going to react this way. I go out there, do my study, and then I portray it afterwards as, look, this is an objective truth that people always respond this way when left alone with an electric shock machine, or people always respond this way when faced with a statement about gender roles, so on and so forth. That now creates problems because people reading my work, people hearing me talk about this, will not understand how I came to this conclusion. When dealing with research, when dealing with this expansion of curiosity into understanding, right? It is very important to think about how you can help yourself and other people understand it. Um, this is spoken about or described as being a good critic. And I'm going to give an illustration about what this is, okay? So, a good critic makes themselves very clear in their work. If you've ever read something that has to do with a matter of taste, like a book review, a movie review, game review, food review, so on and so forth, right? And you disagreed with the author, you read the thing, you thought this was cool, you went and tried it, and you're not like, wow, that person is full of shit. Um, that like the entire experience could have been avoided if they were a good critic. If I make my interest agendas perspectives clear from the start, I start a review of a restaurant by saying, I like spicy food, I was in the mood for spicy food, and I was trying to look for it at any price, right? I start with this. You hear this as the audience, or you read this in the review, and you can already start thinking for yourself. All right, so this guy's inclination, his bias, what he's favoring right now is spicy food. Am I in the mood to find spicy food? And then after that, whatever else I described can be benchmarked and thought about in the context of this. If I go there and say, okay, yeah, the food was actually kind of mild after saying that I wanted spicy, right? You can now evaluate this. Maybe it's not mild, maybe it's just too mild for my taste there and then. It would be even better if I made it explicit. It is too mild for my taste right now. It would be fine on any other day, right? If I say, oh, this was too spicy for me, then now you also have another idea about how that works. So by making yourself clear, right, by accounting for your bias, accounting for where you're coming from, accounting for what you're interested in, accounting for what you hope to achieve, all your work will automatically become useful to anyone else. And I think this is a much clearer way to think about research, dealing with methods of bias in research, than simply saying, oh yeah, just get more empirical data, just get theoretical framings and all that, because that doesn't work. That's a never-ending logical rabbit hole. And this applies to theoretical clarity as well. Why this theory, right? Descriptive consistency. Are you going to use these words in the same ways all the time? Or am I going to say this thing is amazing, and then when I talk about similar thing, I say that thing sucks, right? You need to be consistent with these bits. And so this point about theory, right? Theoretical consistency brings me to the next bit the textbook talks about regarding matters of logic or theory, okay? It claims that a distinction between scientists and everyone else is that scientists avoid illogical reasoning because they use systems of logic consciously and explicitly, and that they have colleagues around to keep them honest. But the thing is, how many of you go about your lives doing things that you know are illogical on purpose? I don't. I would be genuinely surprised if any of you say yes, because that's absolutely not how we process the world. That's absolutely not how we think about our actions or do our things. If we did something, it made sense at the time. If we talk about something a certain way or deal with something a certain way, it makes sense at the time. There is a logic going on there. We can even be explicit and conscious about this if we want. And next thing is, having people around you does not help you avoid unsuitable logics. And I'm going to illustrate this with a point where scientists use both conscious logic and they had colleagues around, but something absolutely like fucked up came out of it anyway. So, phrenology was this science, right? The thing is, it did have scientific method in that it followed empirical steps. There were theoretical build-ups, but it was not good research. It was not good for anyone involved. Basically, the science argued this that since skulls contain brains, this is the general logic, right? Since skulls contain brains, and since the shape of container affects how much can contain within it, you can tell how smart people are based on the skull shape. And they went around measuring people's heads. A lot of this was rooted in colonial racism. The thing is, this was a peer-reviewed logic. There were many scientists working in this field. There were academic journals being published about this and the latest findings in the field and latest methodologies to go about identifying intelligence based on head shape, right? But it's fundamentally used to justify colonialism and racism. This diagram uploaded right there, it's quite clear already that they're trying to show that, oh yeah, black people are closer to monkeys. And that is part of European settler colonialism's absolute fucking racism, okay? This was used to justify it. So since black people are like this, we can treat them this way. Since people who are non-white but not black either, so that's kind of what the middle one is, right? So Orientals are like this. We can treat Orientals in a more colonial way. So black people, they straight up treated them slaves, right? Because they can't think for themselves. They're too dumb to think. It doesn't matter. Orientals are like, oh, they can think a bit, but they're not very smart. So we need to guide them with colonialism. It's the white man's burden to bring civilization to the East and shit like that. So fundamentally, right, this was a peer-reviewed logic, and the logic line is clear. used to justify colonialism, racism, it clearly served an agenda. There's a very clear agenda here, and it was logical. The logic makes sense for people who want to be colonial racists. Okay? But for what it's worth, this information, it was based on empirically false stuff. And well, the slight pity about it is that this logic, right? Or rather, something that's very telling is that because it was logical, there was a logical line going through this pseudoscience of phrenology. Um, it wasn't dismissed by people attacking the logical claim. They attacked the empirical data. They're like, look, we went out and measured all of these skulls and no, there's no such thing. There is no difference. So you got to stop saying that white people are the smartest and everyone else is stupid. It's because there is no difference in skull. And then secondly, size of brain doesn't actually affect how smart you are, so on and so forth. It's like, it's somewhat telling to me that this was dismissed through empirical means and not through rebuttals of the logic. Not through pointing out that, look, this is kind of messed up, guys. Like, you are only using this to justify colonialism, racism. And so I think a much more suitable way to think about logic, right? Because this is what leads it to continue existing. You can't simply dismiss something as illogical. It is always there. If something exists out there, people have justified it or made sense of it. The question now is, what is this suitable for? What does this justify? Who is justifying it? What does it support, right? What purposes does this serve? Who does it work for? Whose agendas does it serve? What does this lead to? It's much more important to think about those bits. And I have the gambler's fallacy here as a short illustration. Because even someone who thinks about the gambler's fallacy and is like, who falls for the gambler's fallacy, inverted commas, falls for the fallacy, right? It's not that they're like making a ridiculous choice there. It's that based on a general idea of probability, you're like, it is unlikely that I would see this so many times. The problem there is that the logic of probability is not suitable for thinking about the logic of the next coin toss. Because the coin owes you nothing to show up that way. It's just very unlikely that this happens. So it's more of a disjoint in logic, it's more of an inappropriate application of logic than it is the gambler being illogical. Okay? All of this extends to matters of theory. As described with phrenology, there were theories that backed it up back then. And for what it's worth, we need to make sure that some of these things never come back. We need to make sure that when we see these things, the questions of who does this serve now get brought up. If it is serving some form of colonial racism, then abandon it. Even if it makes sense, we need to push it aside because all it's going to do is cause shit. So think about for me, right, how I've come to understand this is when it comes to research, it's important to think about, well, what theories are appropriate or suitable under what circumstances. And so having spoken about matters of, empirical data, of bias, and of logic or theory, right? These are the primary research considerations like that I think it's important to summarize here. When you want to start a research project, when you want to explore your curiosities further, it's important to think about what your data represents and how you understand this. So, like, what do you do to get this data? And based on what you did to get this data, how do you know that it represents that, right? Secondly, bias. Be clear about where you're coming from. Be clear about what you intend to do. And I think there's a much clearer way to think about the entire project of research. You are interested to do something. You're interested to find out something in some way, right? So what are you going to do about this? And the last bit, since you want to do something, what are you using to help you get there? What are the theories or logics that you're using to help you get there? The study of methodology is concerned with all of these aspects. How you gather your data, how you process your data, how you reframe or frame your data, right? And with this series, I want to talk more about social research methodologies. I will do that in the next one. By breaking down specifically what certain approaches or certain methods are more useful for or less useful for. And I'm going to emphasize in this series the benchmark of usefulness, right? Or rather the term of usefulness. Because I don't think there's such a thing as good or bad research, good or bad curiosity, good or bad ways of thinking, good or bad ways of doing something. They are instead useful or not useful for certain causes. So if you want to understand something a certain way, what do you do now? And that is something that comes up relatively commonly in social science. If you want to understand, let's say, a certain experience, are you better off studying this experience through a survey? Are you better off studying this experience through a one-to-one interview? Are you better studying this experience through hanging out with them all day and talking to them as they go through the day? Are you That's also called ethnography, or are you better off exploring this experience maybe through a focus group or through a census or through reference to historical data, secondary texts, and all this, right? All of these are matters of methodology, and I will discuss them a lot further as the rest of the series goes on. I hope this has been useful for you. I hope you're interested to tune back in for more, and I would love to hear your thoughts or your comments on any of this. So yeah, with all of that, I'm Isaac. Thank you very much for joining me for this, and I hope to be able to speak to you soon. See you and have a good day.